Welcome on back to History 1301. This is Professor Tatum with yet another lecture for you. Here we'll be looking at some transformations in the nation, looking at further revolutions in the nation after the American Revolution. And in this lecture, we'll be looking particularly at political and cultural changes occurring after the War of 1812. We'll get a little context as always, and some political changes and some cultural changes. This should be pretty straightforward of a lecture. And then the next lecture, we'll see some other changes going on at the time in terms of economics and social changes. A few things we need to remember here. Remember, the War of 1812 ended with a stalemate between Great Britain and the U.S. It was ended by the Treaty of Ghent. Britain basically agreed to call the U.S. To call the war a stalemate. They had destroyed the U.S. Capitol. They could have kept on going. They could have really demolished the U.S. if they wanted to, but they said, "Hey, good game. You put up a fair fight. You asked us for peace, so we'll give it." All right, called it a stalemate. But remember, timing of certain events kind of threw that out of proportion. Remember that it took a good while for news to travel all the way from Europe throughout the U.S. About the end of the war. So people like Andrew Jackson were still out fighting battles. We saw that Andrew Jackson went and fought the Battle of New Orleans, where he killed or captured somewhere around 2,000 British soldiers, had that major victory in New Orleans. And then news of that victory spread much faster than news of the end of the war. So that led to this perception that it was because of that great victory in New Orleans that the war came to an end. Led people to assume Britain went and surrendered, tucking tail and running after the Battle of New Orleans, and then the U.S. were these great victors. Also led to this bigger kind of understanding that we have now whooped this big European empire twice. We are this great, powerful nation, and no one can mess with us. And in turn, this led to this big surge of national pride, right? Led to what I would consider to be kind of the roots of American exceptionalism. People starting not only to be proud to be American, but in some cases to think that perhaps they're something different and something better than everybody else because they're American. This is going to have some problems or lead to some problems rather, for the Federalist Party. Around the same time the news was spreading about Jackson's victory at New Orleans, the Federalists were meeting in protest of this war. We need to keep in mind that by the early 1800s, the Federalists had already lost a good deal of support politically from things like the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Whiskey Tax. But they were generally opposed to this War of 1812 for a few reasons, mainly because their allegiance had been to Britain. They didn't like the U.S. being at war with Britain. And that further got complicated by things like embargoes placed on Britain and restrictions on trade as a result of this war. Remember that they had advocated things like having boom in industry and having the wealthy have partnership with the federal government. All those things are kind of being impacted by being cut off from trade with Britain. So they met in Connecticut, which is up in New England, to protest the War of 1812 at this Hartford Convention. Now, there's kind of a common popular myth, I could say perhaps a misunderstanding, that this convention was all about secession, basically arguing that they were there to say, we're going to secede from the Union if you don't do what we want you to do. That's not quite accurate. Now, there were a few radicals, and they were considered radical individuals there at the conference who may have brought up the idea of secession, mostly kind of facetiously. What this convention as a whole did argue for, though, was that states could interpose their authority if the federal government had overstepped their power, right? So if the federal government, for example, was acting unconstitutionally or was abusing their power, the states did not have to abide by those national laws. That's very similar to the argument that the Democratic Republicans had made during the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in protest to the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Basically saying that the state governments give the federal government its power. Therefore, if the federal government is passing laws that are unjust or unconstitutional, the states do not have to follow those laws. This is kind of funny here because we've already seen contradictions in each of the parties now this early on. Remember, the Democratic Republicans claim to be all about strict construction, interpreting the Constitution very literally, yet they definitely had to use some implied powers and a good bit of government power for that matter as well to carry through with the Louisiana Purchase. Here we're seeing these Federalists who are supposed to be all about strong central government and in turn limiting state governments, saying that, well, when it's convenient for us, the states actually do have the powers to do things that kind of supersede the powers of the federal government. So both parties are kind of bending their policies and their values a little bit when it's convenient for them. But this Hartford Convention ended up proposing several constitutional amendments.
Goals that they had through these amendments were things like limiting the presidency down to one term to keep the same people from continuously coming into power. Also, by that same standard, they wanted to prohibit successive presidents coming from the same states. Reason for this is by this point, there had been what people refer to as the Virginia dynasty, kind of critically, suggesting that all presidents but one, who was John Adams, had come from Virginia. Okay, all the other presidents besides John Adams had come from Virginia, showing that they're kind of dominating politics. And they wanted to break that up a bit, especially since the South, places like Virginia, were strongholds of the Democratic Republican Party. They wanted to create more of a fair opportunity for Federalists to have a chance of getting into office. They also, in response to the War of 1812 very directly, wanted to make it more difficult for the federal government to do things like impose embargoes on other countries or declare war on other countries. Another thing they called for was to overturn the 3/5 clause, which was the clause created by the 3/5 compromise. Remember, that called for 3/5 of the state's enslaved population to count toward their population in terms of representation. Reason they were opposed to this wasn't a moral crusade. It wasn't so much because they were morally opposed to slavery. This was very political. They remember, if the southern states are getting to count 3/5 of their slave population, and they have a large slave population, that's going to increase the number of representatives they have in Congress, therefore increasing their political influence. So they're wanting to limit the southern states' political influence because, again, that's where the majority of the Democratic Republicans are, is in the South. The majority of the industrial Federalists, by contrast, are in the North, so they're wanting to limit the South's power here. Problem, though, again, this all ties back into the essence of timing. As I suggested, this was all going down right around the time the news was spreading through the nation about Jackson's victory in New Orleans. Right around the time that people were getting real pumped up about being Americans and being real proud of this Democratic Republican administration for leading them through this alleged victory, which wasn't really a victory, it was a stalemate, but that's beside the point. And here comes the Federalists saying, oh, we don't like this war and we don't like the current administration and we have some problems and we're not going to abide by what they tell us to do. This made them come across as very unpatriotic. Okay, so this led to a very negative reputation for the Federalist Party and lost them a good deal of political support. And really from here, this would lead to the decline of the Federalist Party, all right? The Hartford Convention pretty directly led to the collapse overall of the Federalist Party. They were never really able to get a whole lot of political clout after this, because remember, they were already losing influence by this point. Then right at the wrong time, they stepped out in opposition to what's going on, and it really lost them the last little bit of support that they had. So the decline of the Federalist Party ushered in what was referred to as, or what we now refer to as, the era of good feelings. So this is a period lasting somewhere from around the end of the War of 1812 to Andrew Jackson's presidency. Historians, like with most things, debate the exact dates, but we kind of roughly agree it's within that time period. And the reason this period gets its name is because throughout this period, there's only one real national political party that has any real influence, and that's the Democratic Republican Party. So the theory is that since there's just one political party, they'll work together and make things happen for themselves. But I think it's quite a bit of an overstatement to really sit there suggesting that they're all getting along singing Kumbaya just because there's one political party. If you look at either one of the political parties in the present, we can see that there could be a good deal of infighting within political parties, right? Hell, there's things that George W. Bush has said in response to Donald Trump that have me agreeing with George W. Bush, and that is just a fucking anomaly, excuse me. I never thought in my life I would agree with George W. Bush on anything, but that just goes to show that within a certain party, there could be just still a good deal of infighting and disagreement, all right? So it really is an overstatement to suggest just because there's one political party that everything's going to be all honky-dory holding hands, all right? But that's the name this period gets. Another result of this growing sense of national pride and national exceptionalism was that the U.S. started to become more confident in its interaction with other nations, right? And they started being much more assertive in their diplomacy. Clear example we can see with that is the First Seminole War. This involved an indigenous nation known as the Seminoles who lived in the Southeast, ranging from like the Carolinas, definitely had a large presence in Georgia and down in Florida. And they were carrying out a lot of raids here in the American Southeast in places like Georgia and South Carolina. And then they would kind of go back to their strongholds down in Florida. Problem for the U.S. was, remember, Florida was controlled by Spain at this time. And so the U.S. could only follow the Seminoles up to the border here. And then they'd kind of have to say, damn it, they got away again. Alongside this, another problem that was going on for the U.S. was several enslaved people were escaping from the southeast here from places like the Carolinas and Georgia and going and seeking refuge with the Seminoles. But again, what can the U.S. do about it? They can only get up to the border to pursue them. After that, they got to disrespect international boundaries. But with this new assertive diplomacy, Andrew Jackson, who we know had played a prominent role in the War of 1812, right? He had led the massacre of the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He also led that major victory at New Orleans after the war was over. He kind of took it upon himself one day to not stop at the border. He crossed international borders and pursued the Seminoles into Florida on his own without the sanction of the U.S. government, still showing just how confident he was at this point in time. Once he got there, he found some Seminole villages where there was a strong African-American presence from enslaved people who had fled with them down there. And he kind of ransacked their villages. Then he took things a step further. He said, well, while I'm down here in this foreign territory, I might as well spread some U.S. influence. And he started taking over cities and raising U.S. flags, saying these are now U.S. territory. All right, and he occupied all these towns like St. Mark's and Pensacola and St. Augustine without government sanction. Also, while he was down there, he found a couple of British subjects who he said, well, y'all must be supporting the Seminoles and y'all must be supporting these enslaved people who escaped. So without giving you any kind of fair trial, I'm going to do the reasonable thing and have you hanged by the neck. And he executed them. We're seeing again here very assertive diplomacy, very aggressive, honestly, going past assertive. He's just storming down, not respecting their borders, not respecting their sovereignty. So the U.S. wasn't 100% on board with this. They're like, Jackson, we kind of admire what you're doing here, but you can't just be going into other countries killing people, all right? So get on back. But still, this kind of aggressive diplomacy here led Spain to realize that if one kind of vagabond commander with no sanction could come into their territory, causing all this trouble, what could he do if the U.S. decided to put all their support behind him? They have no hope of holding on to Florida if the U.S. really wants Florida. So this kind of pressures Spain into sitting down with the U.S. and agreeing to what was known as the Adams-Onee Treaty, also known as the Transcontinental Treaty, in which they negotiated the sale of Florida. This is a clear example, we can see also, of that new assertive diplomacy after the War of 1812. So under this Adams-Onee Treaty, Spain, kind of feeling the pressure there, went ahead and sold Florida to the U.S. to avoid anything happening moving forward. In exchange for this, there was also some disputes resolved over Texas, okay? So some people in the U.S. had argued that Texas was included within the Louisiana Purchase, which really maps show us Texas was never part of Louisiana, but it was just a nice way to kind of stake some claims over certain parts of Texas. And the U.S. agreed that they would keep settlers out of Texas in exchange for Spain selling them Florida. Those are kind of the terms of the Adams-Onee Treaty. Hold that thought. We'll see how well that turns out moving forward and how well the U.S. stands to keeping U.S. settlers out of Texas. Another example we can see of this new assertive diplomacy in action is the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, we need to keep in mind that during that Age of Revolution, remember, which was launched by the American Revolution, a lot of colonies had declared themselves independent nations from various European colonizers, okay? So throughout Latin America, a lot of Spanish colonies had declared independence. In Haiti, we saw that enslaved people declared independence from their French colonizers. And in this Monroe Doctrine, the president, James Monroe, made this declaration saying that if any European nation tried to come reclaim any of those colonies who had gained independence, that the U.S. would back them up militarily, okay? And that they would have to go to war with the U.S. In turn, he also agreed that the U.S. would stay out of European affairs. And again, we'll see how well the U.S. holds to their end of the bargain here. This is, I will suggest, this idea of the U.S. Becoming a police power kind of being born here. This is the first real example of the U.S. using their influence to kind of step into acting that kind of defender role of other nations. But it's very ambitious, okay? They didn't really have the teeth to back this. They didn't have a strong enough Navy or Army to do anything if Europe did actually decide to come in. But still, they got that sense of pride. They got that boost of confidence from the War of 1812 that's leading them to think we can do whatever we want. If we want to defend Latin America from Europe, we certainly can. Luckily, Europe didn't challenge them on that. This, again, is a clear example of that new assertive diplomacy. Another way we're seeing political changes, though, is there's more people able to vote. So remember, only white property owning men could vote. Well, a lot of states throughout this era of good feelings started lifting that property ownership requirement and allowing people without land even to start to vote. White men, that is. Ironically, though, there's more people able to vote, yet we see through these years, this is one of the lowest periods of voter turnout in US history. A few reasons for that. On one hand, politics are just really boring. People kind of already know who's going to get voted in either way. There's one political party, and while there may be rivals within that political party, you know generally what's going to happen. Furthermore, there's no secret ballots in this time. Okay, so everybody knows who's voting for who. You walk in, they say, "Who do you want to vote for?" And you have to answer where everybody hears you. And in some cities, they'll even publish in the newspapers who voted for who. You can only imagine how that might lead to some problems. Imagine, for example, if your boss wants everybody working for him to vote for a certain person and you decide to vote for the other guy, boom, all of a sudden you may find yourself out of a job. Furthermore, you know, again, the same type of people coming to office, not only are they from the same party, they're going to be some kind of elite white men, and most likely they're going to be from Virginia. Like all presidents except John Adams, as I suggested, have been from Virginia so far. So this is kind of making people say, cool, we got the right to vote, but who cares? So really kind of as a result, I'd say, tying right in with these political changes occurring during the era of good feelings, there was also some cultural changes. There's a birth of a unique American culture. So before the War of 1812, as I suggested toward the end of the last lecture, American culture largely mirrored British culture. But now that there's this new sense of patriotism and even the kind of root of American exceptionalism at play now, the U.S. is wanting to create a distinct American culture that is different from European culture. We can certainly see that at play with American art, for example. A clear example is an American painter, Gilbert Stuart, would paint U.S. presidents, famously painted this painting of George Washington, which kind of served later down the road as the face we see of George Washington. This is kind of the model used for the dollar bill, for example. And there's also painters painting things like American Indians and American landscapes, creating this vision of a uniquely American type of art. Literature also. A clear example we can look at is Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. This book is set in Puritan, Massachusetts, and tells a story of Puritans living in Massachusetts. That is something very unique to the United States, that people, what would become the United States, that people in other parts of the world can't quite identify with. It's a very unique American experience, right? Even language was becoming distinct in the United States during the era of good feelings. So Noah Webster, for example, started to create the first American dictionary, where he would make a distinct type of American English that was different than English spoken in England. All right, so for example, dropping U's and words that end with O-U-R are now O-R. So color is not C-O-L-O-U-R in American English, it's just C-O-L-O-R. Plow here in British English would be P-L-O-U-G-H, whereas in American English, it's P-L-O-W. We can think of several other examples, I'm sure. Gray, G-R-A-Y from G-R-E-Y. Magic, we dropped the K. All right, making this, again, very distinct, even way of speaking English to make that level of separation. Clearly, all kinds of both political and cultural changes occurring throughout this period here, right? Creating a very unique American sense of identity.
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap that one up here. Please let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, this is it for now. Over and out.